Thank you very much. I don't know about the wisdom, but I have enjoyed this morning. I think it's been really great. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I've agreed with a lot and also disagreed with a lot. And so because you may disagree with a lot that I'm saying, I thought I would go through a couple of things just to clear this up. And so I do acknowledge that I hold minority viewpoints on many issues, and so that may actually provide an explanation for why you may disagree with many things I say. Of course, that doesn't mean I'm wrong about it, and I always like this quote, truth cannot be determined by a nose count or otherwise by majority vote, right? So even if there's a disagreement, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right or that you're wrong or otherwise. The other thing that's important, I would like to state that these are my official views and not necessarily those of OSU, but also they may not be exclusive to me. And the more important thing is they may not even be necessary. I think a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are just based on common sense and already agreed upon by many of us. And so keep that in mind as we go forward. In order to try to understand the logic of this, I think it's also of interest to go back in time and try to understand why we even bother publishing things. And I know everybody has specific ideas about this, but I think it's a good reminder that this whole business really started in the 17th century in London when, in fact, a German theologian of all started the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, and he laid the foundation really for what we are now still doing in terms of accepting, peer reviewing, and then subsequently publishing material in scientific journals. And the important aspect of this original foundation of the philosophical transactions is that it created competition among scientists. And this idea that it is important to be the first to publish on something new, which is obviously still an important incentive that is held to be of great importance to many journals. Not all journals, but many journals, right? So in fact, there are journals explicitly now suggesting that innovation, novelty, and being the first isn't really an important criterion for acceptance of a certain article. And the other thing is, of course, that we can feel important about publishing things and be the first to publish on something. The other thing that's important is to consider that by publishing journal articles and providing new information available for everybody to see, this allows other people to use that information to build new hypotheses and lay the foundation for subsequent discoveries, right? So this is a very essential enterprise, which is, at least in my estimation, an important foundation for and an incentive for publishing information because it is cumulative. And ultimately, in my estimation, I think this also creates a moral obligation for us to disclose this type of information. So these are all good reasons, but for, of course, a more practical consideration, I don't know if you can read this at the bottom here, but I think an important consideration for publishing, and we've already heard this morning, is of course that it creates job prospects and prospects for promotion, tenure, scientific collaborations, and even financial profit. So I think this thing at the bottom here is really a key incentive for us to be driven towards publishing good and new stuff. Of course, this is not always the case. I've actually tried to find if I could locate specific scientists in the past that weren't really interested in this at all, and I couldn't find anybody in particular. But I was reminded of one of my heroes in music. This is, maybe you guys don't know who this is, but this is one of my heroes in music, one of the great composers of the last century. And he wasn't really interested in any of this. So he didn't care about prestige, not about job prospects or financial profits. And this is the kind of person that had a sign posted at his house that said, visitors unwelcome, right? So he wasn't really interested to communicate with anybody. And so for this kind of individual, of course, publication isn't really driving, what he does on a daily basis. And then at the other extreme, I was thinking about people that, have this drive, but ultimately fail, right? And I think one famous example of that would be, of course, this painter, this Dutchman who lived in France and who ultimately became really depressed, mentally unstable, became an alcoholic, cut off his own ear, and then killed himself. So obviously we don't want this to happen to anybody. Just also for your information, I put in the phonetics of how you pronounce this name, because this is butchered in many languages. But if you're interested, these slides will be available and you can check it out for yourself. But let's assume that everybody cares about being successful and being driven, then these are the things that I think are really, giving the crux of, the take-home messages of what I wanted to convey today. So I think one of the key things is, that your story fits within the scope of a journal. And again, I apologize for most of these being just commonsensical, but I think they're very important. I think one of the things you may want to consider is also the credentials of journals and publishers. You need to know, the kind of things that journals already publish in order to see how your work would fit in there. Something that that you can do is, check out how they present themselves and what the quality is of, their website. What services they offer. This can become really important when it comes to going from one journal down to the next, in a line of journals that is offered by the same publisher. And again, this is kind of commonsensical, but we're not supposed to submit the same thing to different journals at the same time. But I think this is an interesting thing to consider because, as we now know, many publishers offer transfers to sister journals, right? That then can be using peer reviews that have been conducted on initial submissions that were deemed inadequate for consideration in the primary journal. And just like as with grants, we need to follow instructions for authors carefully. And one of the questions that came up with these grant preparations is, is it important that it looks nice, that it's, the aesthetics of it are appealing? That obviously is also very true for manuscripts, right? As a reviewer, you would like to see a manuscript that has been carefully crafted and that looks aesthetically pleasing. And so this is actually a kind of a turn-off for many reviewers if that isn't taken care of properly. So what's important? Same things again. I think these are the two main things that ultimately drive consideration for picking a journal. It must be fitting within the journal scope, and we need to consider the journal itself. And so we're going to talk a little about what's constituting reputation of a journal, both with objective and more subjective measures in a minute. So this can be based either on impact factor. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in the next few minutes. But it's not just that. It's also, what kind of editorial team has that journal in place, what kind of audience can be reached, and, more importantly, what are turnaround times. Obviously, you don't want to necessarily select a journal that will take 2 years for your paper to be reviewed and subsequently published. One of the interesting things is that there's now multiple websites available for people to, to get assistance with the selection of journals. And so this, I don't know if anybody heard of this, but this Think, Check, Submit. Has anybody heard of this? Yes. So this is an interesting, website where you can, go to and then get some good suggestions as to what might be of value to consider in selecting a journal. And so this is based on a number of considerations. So this is what that looks like if you go to this website. And so this is then addressing certain questions as to whether or not the journal that you are considering is trusted and appropriate. And then the important component of this whole system is the checklist. And so the checklist is just essentially a series of questions that you can go through and that you can answer yes or no. And in the case of yes, this provides opportunities for consideration of, appropriateness of a certain journal for, the work that you have in mind. And I think many of these questions are, again, commonsensical and kind of obvious. I think in many cases, we will select journals on the basis of whether or not we are aware of the existence of the journal and whether or not it's a journal that, that we already tend to read and that typically already publishes journals or articles that we consider to be relevant to our own business. So I think this is an interesting thing. These slides again will be made available, and I think you'll be able to to use links and then directly go to pages from this particular site to see if this is of any use to any individual in particular. There's also additional sites from publishing houses that offer services and insights into selection of specific journals for the type of work that you do. One of those I noted is from Elsevier. This is a very interesting tool because you can actually introduce a proposed title of your work as well as an abstract, and then this particular search engine on the basis of a specific research field that you select will then create a list of potential journals that might be suitable, and that kind of narrows down the list, so to say, for things that you could consider. This is something similar. It provides similar opportunities, except the type of information that you can use as input is somewhat more restricted. But I think this is potentially useful. That could be taken into consideration in selecting a journal. So we've already talked about specific indicators of quality of journals that may become really important and become increasingly important. Of course, this is a no-brainer. Just as with grant reviews, we would like our work to be peer-reviewed. This is kind of a staple of modern science, and I think any journal that would forego this path is maybe not something that you would necessarily want to consider. And then additional things like journal indexing and circulation count are obviously important with regards to reaching out to ultimately the audience that you want to see the work that you've been publishing. And then acceptance rate is an important consideration. One of the first on my first slide, I had this picture of these scientists talking to each other and going through an endless list of journals that they had considered for their work, that led to rejections. And so, the rejection rates of journals are an important consideration, right? If you have an interesting story and you target journals that only take 1% of all submissions, then just the odds of then getting it published, in a reasonable time frame become, exceptionally small. So we're going to talk a little about metrics, because I think this is an important consideration for many of us, whether for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. But I think the important take-home point is that whether we talk about journals or authors, there's not a single metric that is fulfilling all needs. And so there's, in other words, no all-purpose indicators of quality as it goes for journals as well as investigators individually. And I've shown this before at another venue, but depending on who you ask, people can have completely different and diverse opinions as to what constitutes, scientific recognition. If you ask my mother, then she would mention these two people because they happen to be on TV all the time in Holland. And then she would also add Dr. Phil because he's on TV all the time. And so obviously this is not necessarily the kind of criteria that we would consider as describing scientific recognition. Likewise, if you ask a more informed lay audience about who are the main scientists in the world, then people may mention these kind of characters, which are very famous in their own right, but not necessarily for the high quality publications that they have offered. And in fact, I don't want to go into great detail about this. Does anybody know this character, Richard Dawkins? He's an evolutionary biologist, very prominent guy in the atheist community, very vocal in many different ways. But nobody really takes this guy seriously as other than an educator, right? And so there's a lot of you can see this on my slide if you're interested. There's a lot of people that have become really aggressively against Dawkins about the kind of things that he says and for pretending being more than he is. So the idea is that maybe we need more objective measures than appearances on TV or appearances on internet blogs. And so you can look at this in many different ways. Of course, what's of interest now is, for today, is what kind of metrics can we use to more objectively consider quality of journals and authors, right? And so we all know impact factor. Who has not heard of impact factor or has no idea what it is? Okay, that's very good. So then I can go through this pretty quickly. Okay, so we all know what it is, how it's calculated. Of course, the other thing that we all know but tend to ignore is that its usage is kind of abused in many different ways because, of course, it was originally designed as a metric to compare different journals within a discipline. It's also commonly applied to compare quality of author impact, right? And this is, an absurd idea that was recognized very early on after the introduction of impact factor, even by the person that came up with the system. And in fact, expressly stated that this metric should not be used, to compare people, but rather journals. Okay, we know how this is calculated. I won't go into this. One thing that I do want to mention is that people have come up with arbitrary cutoff values for impact factor that they consider to be important for no reason. I couldn't find any reason. So people have said, for example, okay, we need to consider anybody publishing in journals with an impact factor of 10. That's what we need to go for some reason. That sounds like a round number. It's good to keep in mind that only about 2% of all journals have an impact factor of 10 or higher. So that if this talk is about selecting journals, then this particular consideration would really greatly diminish the number of journals that you could consider for your particular work, right? So this is quite difficult to reach as an initial target. We've also seen all these lists of going from high to low, and everybody seems to be interested mostly in publishing in journals that have high impact factor. Even though we know that for many journals, this is just one example, but this applies to most journals, that many articles that are being published in particular journals are actually never cited. So the impact factor, as we know it, is driven for many journals by small number of articles that happen to obtain astronomical citations within a given time period. And so this got me really interested to see whether or not, what is this percentage, more globally for, not just for a single journal, but more globally for all journals. And, there's different pieces of information you can find about that in the literature. There's even as high as 90% have been claimed of papers, that are published may never be cited. So that's kind of a shocking realization. And I think that puts in perspective to a great extent, the kind of journal that you would want to target dependent on impact factor. What does that even mean, right? Of course, there's different numbers. In 1990 in Science, people reported it's more close to 55, or in Nature 2 years ago, people said it's 21. But these are still staggeringly high percentages, right? So we need to be really worried about this. If you consider this further, then one of the implications of this is, of course, that maybe we publish too much, right? If a lot of the junk that we submit and that gets published is never cited, should we really bother with, trying to be, excessively productive in terms of quantity at the cost of quality, right? And so even there's people that have very specific opinions about this, and, you can find this citation yourself. So there are investigators that have suggested that we should still continue to publish and try to increase quantity, because ultimately that is correlated with quality. And so that's a very interesting argument that they're trying to make. And I suspect that many of you will receive different types of feedback on how to balance quality and quantity. But I think depending on the decision you make in that aspect, you can find justification for it one way or another, right? So we know all about impact factor, and we also know all about, presumably, the problems that are associated with it. I won't go through this particular example, but I would like you to know, though, that there are additional considerations, that you can look at in terms of, how to judge quality of a journal. And in fact, there's some literature that suggests that impact factor is not even a great metric when it comes to judging quality of a journal, right? So that's an important thing to consider. Not everybody agrees with this, but it is nonetheless an observation made by at least, certain individuals. So there's alternatives to impact factor, eigenfactor. Anybody heard of this? Eigenfactor? Okay. Some of you do. So this is, something that's really radically different from impact factor, and that ultimately also leads to, a different ranking order of journals based on, high to low quality from that particular metric. Regardless of how this is arrived at, I think the important thing, though, is that this is roughly correlated to the number of citations, that are appearing for particular journals within a certain time span. So the total number of cites, as you can see in the figure here, is correlated to that particular metric. And so that also means, for that reason, that periodicals that publish a lot and that obtain a lot of citations are more likely, therefore, through this correlation, to have high eigenfactor values. And as you can see, there's a number of journals that are every year ranked in the top, and so they're journals that we've already heard about earlier today, and also include a journal like the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which is otherwise not having a particularly high impact factor, but in this particular ranking comes out as one of the top journals to consider. So if this is your metric, then this is something to look at, and then see how the journals that might be relevant to your particular discipline are coming out compared to the use of an impact factor. Okay. So we also have metrics, of course, for authors. And so if your goal in life is to publish a lot and publish good stuff, then you can start looking at how particular metrics will could be used to judge quantity and quality of individual author contributions that are not necessarily exclusively dependent on citation counts alone, right? And so one of those is the H-index. Who has heard of H-index? Okay, many of you. Okay. Now I think that's an interesting metric. There's a lot of good and bad things about it that you can find in the literature. Of course, this describes how it's arrived at. I think that's not particularly relevant, because we're running out of time very quickly. But I think what's important to know, though, that there are, as I said, good things about it and bad things. The intended usage is to come up with a measure that captures both quantity and quality. But there are some issues related to it, being not particularly useful, when you consider, let's say, inclusion of a lot of work that may not have been cited very well. This is another common thing that doesn't apply to me, fortunately. My name happens to be relatively uncommon, but many of you that may have more common last names, there may be author confusion, so that leads to, really odd, numbers that come up from H-index calculations. Of course, context of citations isn't captured here. And I think one of the important, disadvantages of H-index is, of course, that it can't really be applied to, comparing authors that have been, in a particular trajectory in their career for different time periods, right? So this is more of a cumulative metric that, maybe disadvantaging young investigators. Of course, that can be accounted for. There are ways to correct an H-index, for the number of years that people have been publishing. And so what do these numbers really mean? Well, nobody really knows, but in the original publication from Hirsch, this is kind of a ranking order that he gives for people that have been in the business for 20 more years or more. And then, he refers to people with any particular H index being successful or not successful, or, should have been National Academy members, etc. This is, kind of generic application of these particular numbers. But there's an increasingly large number of institutions that is taking this metric very seriously when it comes to recruiting and retention and tenure and things like this, and promotion to certain tracks within the academia. And so we now know that places like Johns Hopkins, for example, are now expressly stating that they believe faculty for consideration for full professor, for example, should have certain values, certain H index values, and so this is something that for some institutions has become something of great interest to track. So again, for your own future career, this may only get worse and worse, and so one thing to consider in relation to publishing and journal selection is, of course, to keep a lookout on your own H index. There's a lot published on this. There's some interesting stories you can find about who has higher numbers than others, and there's also a lot of critiques on this. The idea that many Nobel laureates, for example, have terrible H index values, and whereas nobodies like us in pharmaceutics have through the roof H index values. So there's clearly not a consensus yet on how to use this metric and what it really means, right? So, for example, Peter Higgs, his H index is, I think, is 9. That's not particularly stellar, but yet, obviously, he is, a brilliant scientist, right? So, in this particular instance, that's really just not captured very well. There's a number of easy ways to, to consider improving your own H index. Well, since review articles tend to be referenced more widely than regular articles, just publish more of them, right? Even though many H index calculation, sites correct for self-citation, I think there's still, an opportunity to not artificially raise your H index, but to just encourage other people to read your junk and cite it better than they do, right? And then I think one of the easy things to do is to make sure that your biographical information is correct, and that that it can be found online, and that you need to consolidate multiple databases that may have redundant information, and that you may want to register for IDs on certain sites that are readily available, so that you can increase your own visibility, right? So beyond impact factor, we know there's a lot of attention given to alternative metrics that are proposed to substitute or complement this. One of those is this alt metric. Anybody heard about this? Right? Okay. So this captures to a greater extent not only citations to scientific work, but also availability online and appearance in web blogs and things like this. Now there's, in addition to alt metrics and H index, there's an enormously long list of additional alternative metrics that capture quality and quantity of an individual's productivity, right? And so these are some of them, and some are actually kind of funny, and most of them are not serious, but they are serious in the way that they have actually been proposed as something that we should start capturing for individual scientists. Well, this one is obviously not serious, but it's funny. Here's Richard Dawkins again. So these are actually things you can find on this site at the bottom here, and then I came up with 2 of my own. So this is number of postdoc fires because they criticized you, etc. And then Rudy Giuliani index, which is papers you think you published divided by the truth. Okay. Okay. So this is all I have. This is just very quickly, that I think despite all the problems with impact factor for journals and age index for individuals, I think this is still about as good as we can do. There's a lot of activity going on for people to try to improve on those metrics. I think those are very useful things to think about, especially impact factor when you think about the type of journal that you may want to target for your work. And I think whether we like it or not, this age index is something that's going to be around for a long time, and so we need to work with it and live with it, right? And I think the important thing is to try to not become, one of the Kim Kardashians of science and leave the field for the wrong reason. Okay, and I leave it at that. After this particular slide, there's a lot of information on, things you can read up on these materials, and then after this particular slide, there's a list of links that are very interesting, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Thank you.